Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley. I'm one of the co-founders here at the Dyslexia Initiative, and I want to welcome you to the Dyslexia Information Series, Part 1, Welcome to the World of Dyslexia. I'm greeting you today as a friend, because if you're here, then you're part of our large and diverse dyslexia community. Our role within this community is to be a resource, a friend, a cheerleader, a sympathetic shoulder, a listening ear, or whatever it is that you may need. We here at the Dyslexia Initiative believe that we each have a responsibility to each other to be an ally in helping others navigate the road of dyslexia within education. We are all parents, and as a result, we are all also parent advocates. Our mission here at DI is to educate and empower as many people as we can so that everyone can be the best possible parent advocate that they can be. Our children deserve nothing less, and we hope that we can help give you the information and tools that you need to do just that. And we hope that this session, as well as parts 2 and 3, will be a valuable tool in your toolbox. The only caveat I will give is that we are not attorneys, so nothing shown or discussed here should be considered legal advice. And with that, let's get started. A couple of quick announcements, housekeeping really. Don't forget to check out Dyslexia Coffee Talk. When it's scheduled, it airs live on our Facebook channel at approximately 11:30 Central. And don't forget that it's a podcast too. So you can check it out on your favorite podcast platform, or you can head over to our YouTube channel and watch them there as well. We've had some pretty great guests, Dr. Louisa Moats, Dr. Marianne Wolf, William Van Cleve, Peter Wright, Dr. Dale Webster, and many, many more. We have a great season in front of us as well. We're really looking forward to it. The Parent Sessions is a free series where the science of reading is broken down for parents. Currently, we have sessions 1 through 12 recorded and saved on our website, and those cover developing early language skills. All of the handouts, the links, the recordings, etc., can be viewed at this link here on our website. Each of the sessions without the links, etc., can also be viewed on our YouTube channel as well. And don't forget to register on our website for our free quarterly newsletter and any other announcements as they become available. We never buy or sell information, so your registration is always kept strictly confidential. We have a pretty robust agenda for this presentation. We're going to start with what I affectionately refer to as the Ds: dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, SLDs and comorbidity, executive function, what to do if you suspect dyslexia, and signs to watch for. We'll move on to discuss the science of reading and structured literacy. From there, we'll talk about screenings versus evaluations, finding a tutor. We'll quickly go over yours and your child's rights within the educational system. And then, of course, at the end, we have several recommended reading lists as well as resources and helpful links. So let's get started with the introduction to the Ds. We're going to start off with a pretty complicated, for lack of a better word, definition, which comes to us from the International Dyslexia Association's Board of Directors. This was officially adopted in 2002. Their definition is that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition, and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may also include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. That's quite a mouthful. In 2018, I had the ability to attend a lecture that was given by Drs. Sally and Bennett Shaywitz. And Dr. Shaywitz stood up, and during part of her presentation, she said a very concise statement, which is, Dyslexia is a language processing disorder. So if you explore further down into the International Dyslexia Association's website, where they do talk about dyslexia, you can get to a little bit better, less of a complicated definition, if you will, about the definition of what dyslexia is. And the only reason I'm covering the more official definitions is because I think that it's important to understand that dyslexia is recognized by the scientific community, and so it has to be defined. Understanding that is a tool of empowerment that you can use in your favor. So moving on to this specific breakdown for the IDA, which I really prefer over their official definition. They have said in their article called Dyslexia Basics that dyslexia is a language-based learning disability. Dyslexia refers to a cluster of symptoms which result in people having difficulties with specific language skills, particularly reading. Students with dyslexia usually experience difficulties with other language skills, such as spelling, writing, and pronouncing words. Dyslexia affects individuals throughout their lives. However, its impact can change at different stages in a person's life. It's referred to as a learning disability because dyslexia can make it very difficult for a student to succeed academically in the typical instructional environment. And in its more severe form, will qualify a student for special education, special accommodations, or extra support services. I have to add here too that I did drag my husband to this lecture by the doctors Shaywitz because it was very important to me that he have a better insight to dyslexia and the things that were going on with our child in particular. And it was very eye-opening for him, at least, when Dr. Shaywitz shared the statement that dyslexia is a language processing disorder. Like our son used to always say, how did he put it exactly? Remember instead of remember. That kind of drove my husband crazy. And once he participated in this particular part of the lecture, he understood that it was a form of, or it was part of how our son's dyslexia was emanating from him. And once he understood that helped him understand our son a little bit better. And it created more stability in their relationship, which is always a positive. So understand that dyslexia is not just how a child is reading text. It's more than that. It is a language processing disorder. And as much as I hate the word disorder, again, we're talking about scientific-based terms here. So we're going to be using that word throughout this presentation. However, understand that it is absolutely more than how the person is reading the words that are on the page before them. That's a very important correlation to me. Another one is that to a dyslexic child, every test is a reading test. It's not just, their ELA classes, their English classes, however you want to term their reading instruction class. To every child, every test is a reading test. Math, science, social studies, everything is a reading test. We have to break down that barrier and that understanding so that people can understand. The whole world is reading. We wanted to share with you some quotes from some children that we were able to gather for you. And the first one is from a child named Graham. He's age 12. He said, "Dyslexia is more than how well I can read." Braden, age 11, shared with us that, "My friends asked me, why do I get all that stuff? I replied, I have dyslexia. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with me. It's the way that God made me. That's why I get to have a laptop." I like Braden. I think he's a lot of fun. Matthew, age 9, shared a couple of quotes with us. And the first was that dyslexia was a stumbling block. I could not read until a teacher taught me how to read using a way that works for me. I was so scared I would never be able to read like my friends in class, but now I can. And I also try to help those who need help in class too. And also, Mom, I realize how hard it is to be my mom. and how much work you do for me and see. So I'm not sure if I'm cut out for this. It's probably too hard for me to take care of a kid the way that you take care of us. So I'm not sure if I should have one when I grow up. Sawyer, age 12. Sawyer's a little spunky. You're going to like this one. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm probably able to do more than you'll ever be able to because my brain doesn't, or your brain doesn't let you think outside of the box like mine does. Well said, Sawyer. We have 3 quotes from Joya. First, she says, sometimes it will switch around the letters a little bit in the words and I'll lose my place in a book sometimes. So I read ahead and not fully get the book. She also says, I tell them it's not a disease or a disability kind of. It's just a learning difference. It makes you read different and see things differently. And I want people to see me just like a regular person, any other person who's smart. Just see me as normal and not weird because dyslexia that doesn't make you weird. And finally, Matthew, age 10. I wish people could stop looking at all the things that are hard for me and just see how hard I can throw a baseball. That's the coolest thing about me. I have no fear on a baseball field. It's only in school. Moving on to dysgraphia. Again, the International Dyslexia Association has a very complicated definition, and I've included one from Attitude magazine as well, which I thought was quite a good definition. But what I really wanted to focus on was an interview that I had with William Van Cleve about a month before he passed away on Dyslexia Coffee Talk. And this quote is directly from something that he said during our session together. And I think that it's really a great way to explain dysgraphia. And so I want to focus on that. And he said, I think dysgraphia is an accurate diagnosis. I believe in the term, of course, but it's a catch-all for a number of different things. So I think that one of the things that parents would need to do first is to get some accurate information about exactly how the dysgraphia is manifesting itself in their son or daughter, or sons or daughters, depending on the situation. So I have seen students with dysgraphia who have absolutely no spelling issues whatsoever. It is just sort of a language brain-to-hand difficulty with letter formation. I have seen dysgraphic students who can't spell cat. I have seen dysgraphic students whose spelling is good, but their ability to generate ideas and get that onto paper is difficult. So what they do write really isn't effective, but the output isn't what you would expect from a student that age. I have also seen students whose dysgraphia manifests itself as relatively rapid writing. So at first blush, it doesn't really look like there's an issue, but that rapid writing is also relatively illegible and tends to wander, and not with the focus that you would expect from a student that age. So you often see dysgraphia comorbid with dyslexia, but sometimes you don't. There are students with dysgraphia who have no dyslexia at all. There are lots of students with dyslexia with no dysgraphia at all. Dysgraphia isn't a super common diagnosis. And then I think there's another group. There's another group who have been diagnosed with dysgraphia who are really caught by poor handwriting instruction, ineffective instruction. And I wouldn't call those students dysgraphic at all. I would say that with the proper remediation, dysgraphia sort of erases itself. I had a student who was testing as dysgraphic who turns out was poorly taught, and with the correct instruction, more targeted instruction, really, that isn't an issue anymore. So I think your first step in this process is to figure out how dysgraphia is manifesting itself. What are the specific attributes in that child? Because you can't target remediation until you know exactly what you're remediating, basically. Backing up just a little bit. This came from understood.org, and there are 3 different types of dysgraphia. Dyslexic dysgraphia is the form of dysgraphia, spontaneously written text, meaning writing that hasn't been traced or copied, is the most strongly effective. It's often illegible, particularly, as it goes on and on. Spelling, either oral or written, is extremely poor. Drawing and copying are not affected, Finger tapping speed, a commonly used measure of fine motor skills, is in the normal range. Motor dysgraphia most strongly affects fine motor skills, so finger tapping speed is highly abnormal. All forms of writing, either spontaneous or copied, are close to illegible. Drawing and tracing skills are far below average. Spelling skills are usually normal. And then there's spatial dysgraphia. This type of dysgraphia most strongly affects the spatial relationship between the writing itself and the medium on which it's written. This means all forms of handwriting, and particularly drawing, are highly problematic. On the other hand, finger tapping speed and spelling skills are close to normal. But taking into consideration what William was able to share with us, there are a couple of different things. Handwriting. Handwriting is poor to illegible. Sequencing may be backwards, meaning the letters are facing the right direction, but they're shaped with multiple pen strokes and potentially from the ending of the letter to the beginning. And what I mean by that is if you consider a lowercase m. With the lowercase m, you have the stick that comes down and you have the two humps that go over. Well, if your sequencing is backwards, you're going to start at the end, meaning you're going to do the two humps coming back towards the stick, and then potentially with a separate pen stroke, you're going to make the stick, and you may even start from the bottom and go up. So where we may go down and over, a dysgraphic child with handwriting issues may go over and then up with two completely different pen strokes. There's also fine motor. An occupational therapy evaluation, would be necessary to pinpoint fine motor skills that may need developmental work. Written expression. The idea is in the child's head, but it's as if a disconnect exists between the brain and the hand. This was how the first diagnostician that I worked with explained it to me for my own particular child. It took me a long time to understand really what that meant. It's hard to see in the real early years of education because your child's not generating a lot of what I would consider written expression output. But in the later grades, this definitely is going to emanate, and it's going to emanate very strongly. For example, a child that has this particular issue may be able to verbally tell you a story with 1,000 details attached to it. But when it comes to the writing process, they will create the shortest, most direct sentences that they can. It may have extremely poor spelling, poor punctuation, capitalization, periods are a big struggle for the child. So it's a lot of people, I think, struggle with this particular facet because verbally the child is so strong, but when it comes to generating written output, there is definitely a breakdown. But it's important to target remediation based on the need, which may include handwriting, penmanship, spelling, occupational therapy, and of course, every child, regardless of dyslexia, dysgraphia, normative, doesn't matter, should have explicit instruction in written expression. This is a very important aspect of education and one that is unfortunately not being properly addressed in a balanced literacy setup. I've included a quote here. It's one of my favorite quotes. It comes to us from Pam Alwyn. And she said that reading is breathing in and writing is breathing out. And this is really true. Reading and writing must both be taught explicitly, and they are both two different and distinct skill sets. But they do very much correlate one to the other. There's a lot of data that shows that reading will plateau at a certain point if written expression is never taught or taught correctly. There's only so much that can move forward and happen, but written expression aids fluency as well as aids comprehension. So both must be taught explicitly, and they must be taught explicitly at the same time. You shouldn't just teach reading and then later on teach writing. That's not how that's going to work effectively for really any child. But moving on to dyscalculia, the easy way to sort of explain this is I like to tell people it's dyslexia for math. But people with dyscalculia have trouble working with numbers and understanding mathematical-based concepts. Experts say that dyscalculia is a common learning difference, though it's commonly overlooked. Signs of dyscalculia can come up as early as preschool, but often go unnoticed. Or the signs may be ignored, as it's assumed that person is just bad at math. Some trouble areas to look for are seeing how numbers fit together, counting, calculating, recalling math facts, using concepts like less than or greater than, using various mathematical symbols, telling left from right, reading an analog clock, and of course, working with dollars and coins. We need to talk a little bit about SLD, specific learning disabilities, and comorbidity. They are two different things, and that's an important thing to understand. So, what is a specific learning disability? Specific learning disability, or SLD for short. You're going to hear SLD probably thrown around a great deal within our community, is one of the 13 criteria to qualify for protection under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA for short. This is a law that protects people between the ages of birth and 21 that are subject to the rights of attendance in a public educational establishment. As a side note, specific learning disability covers dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia, and it is important to note that dyslexia is named within IDEA. Under section 1401, under 30, specific learning disability includes the word dyslexia. So if a specific learning disability is dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia, then what is a comorbidity? This is a really kind of, or the technical definition of comorbidity, I should say, because it's more of a medical term. It's kind of a scary sounding term, but what it boils down to is it's the presence of more than one diagnosis within an individual. Note that this is not more than one SLD, but it is an SLD plus another diagnosis. The most common comorbidity with dyslexia is ADHD. Other common comorbidities are depression, anxiety, and others. Per one study, dyslexia was present in 33%, anxiety disorder in 28.8%, developmental coordination disorder in 17.8%, language disorder in 11%, mood disorder in 9.4% of patients. Some pretty large numbers, and comorbidity is one that definitely should not be overlooked, especially, I really encourage parents to be on the lookout for anxiety and depression as they work their way through the public education years. So this is a table that comes to us from the 95% group. This is copyrighted by them, and I've included it here, and as well as cited it specifically for your reference. They have various comorbid issues, and of course you see dysgraphia, which is a SLD listed under comorbidity, but it helps you have some names, quick definitions, some signs, and some prevalence with dyslexia. But I also wanted to add an executive function. So executive function is the ability to organize cognitive processes. This includes the ability to plan ahead, prioritize, stop and start activities, shift from one activity to another activity, and monitor one's own behavior. Understood.org has an enormous amount of information available on executive function, which I highly recommend reading, and their various videos I also highly recommend watching. I've included some key links that I think are really important that are on their site that you should take some time to read for yourself. 3 areas of executive function, symptoms of executive function disorder, 5 ways executive function can impact reading, and Executive Function 101 ebook. I'm also a big fan of the book by Paula Moraine called Helping Students Take Control of Everyday Executive Functions. Sometimes she teaches a class that goes along with the book. You would have to look on her own site for that information of when the class is offered. But if you have that opportunity, I do recommend taking her class if that's one that is open to you. Also, if you go to our website, we have a pretty robust presentation about the signs of executive function by age. So if you go to our website, under the world of dyslexia, we have a page for executive function, and that presentation is on that page as well. But executive function is definitely not something to be overlooked. I think a lot of people think that executive function is just really when a child is completely out of control. I know for a fact that my child has executive function issues, but if you scaled everything, his seemed to be pretty minor. Organization is not something that he's very good at. Taking notes is definitely a breakdown for him as well, but organization is really the one that drives me up the wall because I'm a highly organized person. But that's something that we try to meet each other in the middle on. The Shaywitzes on their site, Dyslexia's, the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity, has some really great information on what to do if you suspect dyslexia. And this is from their Act Early section. So remember that dyslexia is genetic and that it can run in families. If you or your spouse is dyslexic, there is at least a 50% chance that one or more of your children may be dyslexic as well. So I like this quote from their site. And what she said was, the 5-year-old who can't learn her letters becomes the 6-year-old who can't match sounds to letters. By age 11, she is the child who would rather hide in the school bathroom than read out loud in class. At 18, her excruciatingly slow reading makes it nearly impossible to finish important tests in the allotted time, potentially hurting her college and career prospects. The thread persists throughout a person's life, but with early intervention, this scenario doesn't need to happen. Delays in breaking the phonetic code means a child will miss much of the reading practice that is essential to build fluency and vocabulary. Then when that crucial shift from learning to read to reading to learn occurs around 4th grade, that child will fall further behind in developing comprehension skills and acquiring knowledge through reading. So some things to observe if you suspect dyslexia. Observe your child's language development. Be on the alert for problems in rhyming, pronunciation, and word finding. Observe your child's ability to connect print to language. Notice if he or she is beginning to name individual letters. A good example of that, and something that, if I had known anything about dyslexia at the time, I think would have been a major red flag for me, was how my child sang the ABCs. Of course, he, as a toddler and very young child, he absolutely loved to sing, and he would sing all the time. And one of his favorite songs was, of course, the ABCs, because as children, they sing it in preschool all of the time as well, right? Well, he would start off fine, A, B, C, D, but LMNOP was not LMNOP. It was just one sound, LMNOP, LMNOP. He wasn't hearing the different sounds. So his phonological awareness with the alphabet itself was not developed the way that it should have been. So this is a really important thing that we have within the parent sessions content. And there's even a different way to sing the ABC song so the children can hear the various sounds. I highly recommend checking out those sessions and that content. Additionally, know your family history. Be alert to problems in speaking, reading, writing, spelling, or learning a foreign language. Some families with more than the average complement of dyslexics seem to have an abundance of photographers, artists, engineers, architects, scientists, and radiologists. Somewhat less frequent, but still impressive, are the large number of families sprinkled with great writers, entrepreneurs, and jurists who are dyslexic as well. If you see evidence of problems with spoken language, learning letter names, and especially if there's a family history, have your child tested. Focus on strengths, not just on weaknesses. The goal is to make sure that a child's strength, rather than their weaknesses, define their life. We have some signs to watch for included within this presentation, which of course will be posted on our website, so bear that in mind. But if you, like so many of us, did not act early, don't worry. Start the journey where you find yourself today. Have faith and never give up. With the right supports and remediations, your child will be unstoppable. Know that. Trust that. It's going to be okay. And one final note, just because I have to absolutely throw this in here. Behavior is communication. An undiagnosed and/or an underserved dyslexic child will act out in a variety of ways. Anxiety is real. Depression is real. Some children may be violent, some may withdraw, but know that all behavior is communication. If you feel that the child that you've always known is no longer present, please trust and follow your instincts. Sadly, many times school will lead with behaviors before seeking the causes behind the behaviors. You are the greatest advocate and the only voice that your child will have during their years in public education. Trust yourself that you know what is right. Don't be afraid to challenge what doesn't sound helpful, what doesn't sound right, everything that goes against what your instincts are telling you. You have the right to push back. You are the parent. You are the expert on your child. Do not ever let anybody tell you or convince you otherwise. I'm a big believer in that. You are the parent. You are the expert, and you do not have to ask for permission to challenge the system. The system, in a lot of cases, I'm sad to say, they're not going to be right here. You are. Don't be afraid to push back. But let's move on now to the science of reading and structured literacy. Did you know that reading and writing are a human invention? They are. Humans developed reading and writing about 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. The history of how humans developed reading and writing is explored in detail in Dr. Marianne Wolf's book, Proust and the Squid. The first third of the book will cover the history, and I do highly recommend it. It is a dense book from a historical perspective, but she does a very good, she's very good, I should say, at breaking down the history and sharing all of it with you. So I do very much recommend her book. And while speaking is natural, reading and writing are not. And because they are not, they must be taught explicitly. There's a difference between implicit and explicit instruction. And explicit is the only way to go with reading and writing. Some statistics for you. The National Institute for Child Health and Human Development says that 25 to 35% of learning to read is accomplished with ease. 60 to 65% experience this with great difficulty. And about 20% find reading to be the hardest academic subject that they will encounter. And those are our dyslexic children. Reading development via Uta Frith's model is that there are 3 stages. The first one is logographic. That means that there's instant word recognition on a basis of salient graphic features, visual features like stop signs. Alphabetic, meaning the letter sound by letter sound analysis, putting together of sounds to evoke a word. And third, orthographic, instant recognition of the morphemic parts that a child becomes more and more aware of letter clusters and morphological units. That's the actual process of learning to read. Reading is not developmental. It must be taught explicitly. So I have a couple of videos here that I provide within the presentation. And the first one is a usable minute about what is dyslexia and is my kid learning how to read, part 1 and 2. And then, of course, I have 3 of Emily Hanford's podcast, or reports, not podcasts, sorry. What the words say, hard words, why aren't our kids being taught to read, and at a loss for words. What's wrong with how schools teach reading? So the main thing that I wanted to show you here was, is my kid learning how to read? Part 1, the purple challenge. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second, and I'm going to shift over to that video. And we're going to watch that real quick because it's really important that this particular message within this video be understood. So it's a 12-minute video, but again, it's really important to this content. And so I hope that you enjoy it.
Hi there, I'm the mom of a first grade student. I've started getting curious about how my child is learning how to read in school. I'm a PhD level behavioral scientist, and I made this video because I'm trying to make sense of some contradictions I see between the well-established science of reading and how kids are actually being taught to read. Here's one thing I'm really confused about. Perhaps you've noticed your child being assigned books according to their just right reading level. These reading levels follow the alphabet like A, B, C, etc. What's strange is that these books often contain words that are pretty hard for a little kid to sound out, such as community or purple. It seems like kids are just supposed to memorize these words. To make it easier, kids are taught tricks for how to guess words when they get stuck. They can, for example, guess a word that makes sense. They can use the picture to guess the word, and they can even just skip the word entirely. Now you might be wondering, can't kids also just use phonics? It's true that phonics is suggested as one of various tools kids can use to figure out a word, but as I hope will become clear over the course of this video, what's actually happening in the early grades is that kids are not learning enough phonics skills to sound out the types of words that show up in the books they are actually reading. Furthermore, the other cue-based strategies, such as guessing from pictures or from context, are, according to experts, actually undermining their ability to read. All of this controversy got me wondering, will my kid learn how to read this way? I decided to do an experiment to find out, using Reading A to Z, also known as Raz Kids. This popular reading app uses books at the just right reading level. So I'm going to show you an online book, but what we learn here should apply to regular books that also use these just right levels. Here's how I did my experiment. First, I had my daughter read a book on Raz Kids. Then I had her read the same story, but this time with the pictures covered. Then I had her read the harder words from the story with no pictures and no context. And finally, I tested these words again the next day to see how much my daughter had learned. So what do you think? Will she learn these new words even though she doesn't have the phonics skills to sound these words out? Let's see what happened.
I ate paint my Purple. I paint the fence purple.
Yeah, it's amazing how you're reading without even looking at the words.
I paint the door purple.
Great.
Look at all that purple. I paint my mom purple. Mom doesn't ought not like purple. It paint.
Overall, not too bad, and she's nailing the word purple. Let's see what happens when we take away the pictures.
I put my swig up.
Okay, great.
Up.
Okay.
Paint.
Okay. That's not what I was expecting. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead. It doesn't work that way. You can tell she's really thrown off by the lack of pictures. She even forgets momentarily how to sound out words at all. It's a little hard without the picture.
Paint. I like paint the fence.
Good.
Purple.
Okay.
I paint the door purple.
Nice. She's starting to get the hang of it again. She doesn't have pictures to look at, but the sentences are pretty repetitive, so she can kind of figure it out from the context and the pattern.
Mom does not like purple paint.
Nice. That was a strong finish. Now let's see what happens when she doesn't have any pictures or context to help her.
Swing.
All right.
Paint.
Okay. Let's see how she handles words that she doesn't really know how to sound out. Those words were a little tricky, but she'll definitely get this word. I mean, she saw this word, what, a million times? It's like she'd never seen the word before in her life. You can actually see the camera frame shaking because I'm so stunned. When we tried again the next day, it wasn't much better. I wasn't expecting this at all. How could she be exposed to a word so many times, have it appear on every single page,
Look at all that purple.
and then not even recognize it 5 minutes later? Now, she did get some words right without pictures or context, but check out how her accuracy changed over time. The green boxes represent correct responses. When the pictures went away, her accuracy suffered. When she tried the words without pictures or context, she did get some words right, but notice which words they were. They were the words she was able to sound out. The words she previously guessed from pictures or context, she could no longer read once those cues were taken away, nor could she read them the next day. Okay, but you might be wondering, why didn't you just help your kid learn those new words? But here's the thing, in first grade, parents are really encouraged to let their kids read these books independently. Here's a video directed to parents that explains this.
Their teacher is helping them be independent. Support your child in being independent. You could provide your child with a timer if you want them to read and try to stretch their stamina, but also reread their texts over and over again. We want to encourage children to keep reading, or even that they're reading with a stuffed animal or an action figure. They take some time to set up a reading spot where they can focus on their reading with limited distractions.
Now, I'm not saying that it's all independent reading, but there is a lot of it. And it's not clear to me how a beginning reader who doesn't yet know how to read a lot of words is going to learn how to sound out new words and learn from her mistakes without a grown-up looking over her shoulder. Maybe if we want kids to read independently, we should give them books with words they have actually been taught how to read. So this brings me back to the word purple. Why was it so difficult for my daughter to learn how to read this word, even though she was able to guess purple by looking at pictures and guess it again by looking at context? Well, it turns out that guessing words from different clues, such as pictures, context, or repetitive sentence patterns, is a highly inefficient and ineffective way to learn how to read. Incredibly, this method, which is called 3-cueing, is strongly promoted in the Lucy Calkins Reading Workshop curriculum, one of the best-selling reading programs in the U.S. Many children who learn these methods have to be retrained later before they can learn to read properly. But here you might be wondering, don't we all use context to better understand what we're reading? Sure, we do use context for reading comprehension. However, before we can comprehend what we read, we must read the actual words themselves. This is known as decoding. If you can't properly decode, context is not going to help you make much sense of what you're reading. Research has shown that people who are successful readers automatically process all the letters of a word as they are decoding. They do this because at some point when they were little, they learned how to sound out the words using the letters. People who are successful readers do not use 3-cueing. They do not decode words from context, from pictures, or from sentence patterns. This makes sense if you think about it. You're not going to be very successful reading the words in the Constitution or the Gettysburg Address if you're hunting around for clues. Decades of research have shown that it is in fact poor readers who continue to decode words using clues. People who read this way are slower at reading, they read more inaccurately, and they are more likely to find reading difficult and unpleasant. Unfortunately, school districts such as ours across the country have spent millions of dollars on curricula that promote these ineffective strategies. Parents, educators, and activists have begun mobilizing to demand that kids start getting instruction that aligns with the science of reading. So you might be wondering, what actually does work to teach a kid how to read the word purple? Well, to find out the answer to that question, please watch part 2 of this series, where I do another experiment, this time using phonics.
All right. So I hope that you found that rather illuminating. Illuminating about the way that reading instruction is being taught within the country. It's not just our dyslexic children that are being left behind, but it is honestly the vast majority of children that are being left behind. Our dyslexic children are simply, as we like to say, the canary in the coal mine. We will watch part 2 of her series in our part 2 session. So please come back for that if you have time. So how the brain learns how to read. I've included within this presentation a great deal of kind of complicated information, and I'm really just going to kind of skim over that here. But it's important to know that there is no specific place in the brain that we use to read. There's no reading center. Reading involves multiple processes that tap into different regions of the brain. Advances in neuroscience in the 80s enabled scientists to unravel the principles underlying the brain's reading circuits. Brain imaging using fMRIs, or functional magnetic resonance imaging, enables researchers to create images that reveal information about brain anatomy and activity while reading. It reveals the parts of the brain that activate when we do read. So people who become experienced readers use and integrate several regions of their brain, primarily in the left hemisphere. But it's important to remember that while different regions can be identified in terms of playing certain roles in the reading process, multiple parts of the brain during reading are in constant collaboration with one another. Seidenberg notes that some scientists hold the view that each major type of information during reading is supported by a network of brain structures rather than localized to a single area, and that each brain area is responsive to and participates in the processing of multiple types of information. So like I said, I've included a lot of very complicated information, and I do encourage that if you are on the dyslexic journey, that the science behind how the brain actually learns how to read be a journey that you take. Like I mentioned, Proust and the Squid by Dr. Marianne Wolf is a fantastic book that helps with some of the science. But Dr. Mark Seidenberg's book, Language at the Speed of Sight, is also quite phenomenal. I also really encourage looking into the work of Dr. Stanislaus Dehaene. So the brain changes as we learn to read. What we know is that every child's brain has to change the way it functions as the child learns to read. For most students, instruction and practice during the primary grades is sufficient to train the regions in the brain to learn how to read. Brain imaging research has revealed the anatomical and functional changes in typically developing readers as they learn to read. Cunningham and Rose noted that activation patterns in areas of the brain will be different depending on the student's reading ability. But what does brain imaging reveal about struggling readers? Cunningham and Rose again point out that the brain scans of struggling readers show that the pattern of activity are notably different. They're more scattered than those of strong readers. The pathways for language and cognition are not as efficient or as well established. So the work of reading is harder for our children, even though he or she is trying just as hard. For children with dyslexia, their brains do not often develop in a way that makes them efficient readers. The brain imaging studies that are fMRIs have found that the reading process works differently in the brains of dyslexics because there is a neurological cause of dyslexia. Dyslexic readers show underactivation in areas where they are weaker and overactivation in other areas in order to compensate. Instead of using the parts of the brain in the left hemisphere, dyslexics who struggle to read use different parts of the right hemisphere, which is not quite as efficient. Shaywitz found that children who are good decoders had more activation in the areas that are important for reading in the left hemisphere and left in the right hemisphere than children with dyslexia. Furthermore, many people with dyslexia often show greater activation in the lower frontal areas of the brain, possibly because their frontal regions may compensate for problems in the regions in the back of the brain. So I've shared all of this again just to illustrate the point. There is phenomenal amount of science. The empirical data is overwhelming regarding how the brain learns how to read. And again, bearing in mind the purple video, we have to take that into consideration when our children are actively being instructed on how to read. There's really only one way to do it, and that is through the science of reading, which we call structured literacy. I'm going to flip past the rest of these slides, but I've included them in the presentation as well as links to provide you with more information about the science of reading, or science of how the brain learns how to read, excuse me. So knowing all of that, what then is structured literacy? Structured literacy is an approach that emphasizes highly explicit and systematic teaching of all of the important components of literacy. These components include both the foundational skills, meaning decoding and spelling, which is encoding, and higher level literacy skills like reading comprehension and written expression. Structured literacy also emphasizes oral language abilities essential to literacy development, including phonemic awareness, sensitivity to speech, sounds, and oral language, and the ability to manipulate those sounds. Explicit teaching means that teachers clearly explain and model key skills. They do not expect children to infer these skills only from exposure. Systematic means that there is a well-organized sequence of instruction with important prerequisite skills taught before more advanced skills are introduced. For instance, children master decoding and spelling simpler consonant vowel consonant words, e.g. TAP, T-A-P, with short vowel sounds before learning more complex short vowel words like stamp or tapped with consonant blends or affixes. Explicit systematic teaching requires teacher-led instruction. Teacher-led instruction enables educators to provide prompt, targeted feedback in response to children's mistakes, which is another characteristic of structured literacy. For example, suppose that children are practicing reading words with short vowel and consonant blends aloud, and a child misreads stamp as stump. Rather than just telling the child the word, the teacher might point to the vowel to draw the child's attention just to that vowel. If that cue did not help, the teacher would provide additional feedback focused on the child's specific error. All of this is sourced directly from the International Dyslexia Association's explanation of here's why schools should use structured literacy. They also have an amazing graphic that can be printed off and put anywhere. I actually have frequently sent this graphic to teachers. I've never printed it and provided it to them, but I have sent this link to many a teacher. I wanted to break down the image into a couple of different components so that you could see the various components of the poster, but it's a great visual image that explains specifically what is structured literacy. This part I really like because it breaks down the various components: phonology, sound symbol association, syllables, morphology, syntax, and semantics. They all must be taught explicitly, as well as the three principles that guide how structured literacy elements are taught: systematic and cumulative, explicit, and diagnostic. That is key. So now that we know difference between, or now that we, not the difference, now that we know that the brain learns to read in a very specific way, and that there is a way to specifically teach reading per the science of reading, structured literacy, let's move on to talk about the difference between screening and evaluation, because they are two very different things. The purpose of screening for dyslexia is to identify students at risk for dyslexia and reading difficulties, and students on track for successful reading outcomes. Screening data are used to make decisions about the level of instructional support that students may need as well. Screeners should be targeted in kindergarten through second grade, the point being to administer them as early as possible. Screeners should be looking for red flags that may indicate the child is or could be struggling learning how to read. It's important to note that the National Center for Learning Disabilities says that dyslexia can be identified as early as the age 5.5. The IDA has also put together an amazing article explaining screening in depth, and we recommend familiarizing yourself with this content. The article can be found at this link, and again, this presentation will be posted with this video on our website. But know that screeners are not evaluations. Screeners are looking for red flags. They are not a diagnostic tool. So if a child has been screened and red flags do appear, proceeding on to an evaluation may be your best path to ensure targeted remediation can begin as soon as possible. But remember too that you can begin to work supporting your child's needs right away with explicit instruction in the science of reading, i.e. structured literacy, and foster early reading skills. Evaluating for dyslexia, like we said, is not the same thing as screening. Screening's red flags, evaluation is diagnostic. So an evaluation for dyslexia or a language learning disability is a comprehensive assessment that provides you with a clear understanding of your child's competencies in the following areas: oral language, phonological skills, phonemic awareness, rapid automatic naming, decoding, reading fluency, i.e. rate and accuracy, reading comprehension, spelling, and writing, articulation skills, social skills, and or oral motor difficulties may also be a part of the evaluation. An evaluation is not performed by your child's pediatrician, and they may not know where to direct or refer you. You have two routes for an evaluation. Everyone has the right to a public school evaluation. Per IDEA, all students with a suspected disability, age birth to 21, should be evaluated by your local public school, whether or not your child is even enrolled there. This evaluation is at public expense. If you have the means, there's also a route to the private evaluation. This is funded by the family of the child suspected of having a disability. The family locates and engages with a private evaluator. Your public school does not have to accept, but they are supposed to consider the private evaluation. So bearing that in mind, there are two different kinds of diagnosticians available via the private route. You have a diagnostician, which is not a neuropsychologist, but may have a variety of licensure that allows them to conduct an educational evaluation. Then there's a neuropsychologist. They are in the field of clinical neuropsychology, which is a specialty field within clinical psychology. They are dedicated to understanding the relationships between brain and behavior, particularly as those relationships can be applied to the diagnosis of brain disorders, assessment of cognitive and behavioral function, and the design of effective treatment. They're going to engage in what I like to call a whole child evaluation. This is a method that aims to shed light on students' social, emotional, mental, physical, and cognitive development, and focuses on the long-term development of the child. So let's shift gears and talk about finding a tutor. What to search for when you are seeking a tutor for your child, if that's something that is an option that's open to you. There are a few things to consider. Like the quote from William Van Cleve that we talked about earlier within this presentation, it's important to know exactly where and how the child is struggling in order to understand how to target the most effective remediation. The idea that a child is struggling to read and just needs more reading practice is the same thing as throwing a bad swimmer in the deep end of the ocean and thinking that they're going to learn how to swim. there are multiple questions that need to be asked. Does the child have phonological holes? For the example of my child singing the ABCs, LMNOP was not LMNOP, it was one sound, one letter. He had phonological holes. Is he struggling with phonemic awareness? Are there additional specific learning disabilities or comorbidities or both that could be contributing to how the child learns? A thorough evaluation will answer these questions for you, or at least it should if it's a quality evaluation performed by someone who really knows what they're doing and understands dyslexia and how to look for dyslexia. Second, not just anyone can work with your child. It's a very sad reality, but unfortunately, this is the reality that we live in. One has to understand that the balanced literacy techniques used in most American classrooms are never going to teach a child how to read, especially not our dyslexic children. Understanding and using the science of how the brain learns to read via structured literacy is the only way. Just because someone is a teacher does not mean that they have the knowledge and training in the science. Sadly, most university programs are entrenched in balanced literacy dogma and therefore deprive their teaching students this very valuable knowledge. So if your teacher is offering help, that's amazing. It's important to understand that the only way forward, though, is with structured literacy delivered explicitly. A quality tutor is also going to be prescriptive. And what I mean by that is that most programs have a scope and sequence and a defined fidelity. What that means is that there is a defined pace and frequency by which the program must be followed in order to meet fidelity. For example, 45 to 60 minutes per session at a minimum of 4 days a week. That's fidelity. But for some of our children, that pace is just, that scope and sequence, that pace is just too fast. For some, if a child's undergone years of tutoring already, but has core phonological deficits that were ignored, those deficits have got to be addressed before proceeding any further. You may also find that once that particular child who's undergone years of tutoring, who had phonological holes that were ignored, that once those phonological holes are filled, that all those years of tutoring may come together and all of a sudden you can skip ahead, but that prescriptiveness allows you to do those kinds of adjustments. The point is that every child is different, and it's critical that you understand where to target the remediation for your specific child and their specific needs. One of the biggest questions that we get at at the Dyslexia Initiative is, what programs do we recommend? And the answer to that is we don't recommend programs. What we do is defer to the IDA list of approved programs, which can be found at the link within this presentation. So we recommend that you find someone that's trained or possibly in training, depending on how far along they are, who's overseeing their training, how they're reporting their training hours, et cetera, in one of the IDA programs. Some of these organizations that are listed within the IDA's list can provide you with a list of recommended tutors if you reach out to them directly. Another alternative is don't be afraid to call the major dyslexia schools in the country. They're really going to be mad at me for this, but for example, I learned that some of the teachers at the Landmark School, which is in the Boston area, once COVID set in, created an online tutoring group. And that was due to the demand that was presented to the school. It's important to note that that is not owned or operated by the Landmark School, and that needs to be perfectly clear. This is a separate tool, though, that's available by some very highly qualified teachers. The key is that the tutor that you find, they need to understand, I'm tripping over my words, that demand is greater than supply. But the tutor that you find needs to be your family's partner in your child's education, that they're capable of being prescriptive to your child's needs. They know when to slow down. They know when to speed up. They know when to circle back to particular lessons and can focus on both reading and written expression because both need to be worked in tandem. Additionally, don't be afraid to enter the fray and work with your child yourself. This is one of parents' greatest fears, is they really believe that they can't teach their child themselves. They don't have the knowledge. Don't be afraid to enter that fray and work with your child yourself. There are some amazing resources out there for parents, like Homeschooling with Dyslexia, which is an online site. They also have a Facebook page. We have the parent sessions, which is stepping parents through the science of reading and how to work with your children. There's Word Wasp, there's Toe by Toe. There's many resources that are out there. And potentially, given your own personal resources, you may consider training in one of the programs that IDA recommends, if that would make you feel more comfortable. But again, don't be afraid to enter that fray yourself. So this is a section that honestly, I'm going to fly through very, very quickly. But what are your rights and your child's rights in the educational system? Currently, we have ESSA, but before that, we had the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. These are all federal laws, and that's one thing to understand. But No Child Left Behind was replaced by ESSA. And ESSA is a US law, the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. And this governs the United States K-12 education policy. ESSA leaves significantly more control to the states and districts in determining the standards that students are held to. States are required to submit their goals and standards and how they plan to achieve them to the US Department of Education, which must then submit additional feedback and eventually approve. In doing so, the Department of Education still holds states accountable by ensuring they're implementing complete and ambitious yet feasible goals for students. Students will then be tested each year from 3rd through 8th grade, and then once again, their junior year of high school, These standardized tests will determine each student's capabilities in the classroom and the success of the state in implementing its plan. In other words, if you want to know where standardized testing comes from, there you go. The states are also left to determine the consequences of low-performing schools and how they will be supported in the following years. The U.S. Department of Education defines low-performing schools as those in the bottom 10% of the state, based on the number of students who successfully graduate or the number of students who test proficient in reading and language arts and mathematics. Again, I've got a lot more information included here about ESSA. I also have FERPA. FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1984. So this is the Privacy Act, honestly. This gives parents access to their children's educational records, an opportunity to seek to have records amended, and some controls over the disclosure of information from the records. The FERPA is something that you're going to hear a lot used in schools, especially if you have a dyslexic child, as you ask specific questions. But FERPA is your right to have access to all of your child's information, but it also blocks you from having access to other children's information. So bear that in mind. IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is honestly the hallmark, the cornerstone of our specific community. This is legislation that ensures that students with a disability are provided a free and appropriate public education, FAPE, that is tailored to their individual needs. IDEA was previously known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. And in 1990, the US Congress reauthorized the Education for All Handicapped Children Act and changed the title to IDEA. Overall, the goal of IDEA is to provide children with disabilities the same opportunity for education as those students who do not have a disability. IDEA is composed of 4 parts, the 2 main parts being Part A and Part B. Part A covers the general provisions of the law, while Part B covers assistance for education of all children with disabilities. IDEA has 6 main elements. The first is pillar number 1, the IEP, the Individualized Education Program. This is for each student who is found to be eligible under IDEA. The IEP describes the student's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, otherwise known as the PLAF, and how the student's disabilities affect or would affect the child's involvement in the general education curriculum. The IEP also specifies the services to be provided and how often, and it specifies accommodations and modifications to be provided for the student. Sorry, that was important. It also guarantees the participation of the parent and gives the parent a lot of teeth within the education of their child. Number 2 is FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Education. Guaranteed by IDEA, it's defined as special education related services that are provided at the public's expense, under public supervision and direction, and without charge. Meets the standards of the state education agency, include an appropriate preschool, elementary, secondary school education in the state involved, and are performed in conformity with the individual education program under Section 614D. FAPE is a huge pillar that we as a community stand on, challenging that free and appropriate public education is not met if our children are not reading on grade level. LRE, least restrictive environment. This is the hallmark where special education is a service and not a place. Least restrictive environment requires that to the maximum extent appropriate. Children with disabilities, including children in public or private institution or care facilities, are educated with children who are not disabled. This is general education classroom. Again, special education is a service. It is not a place. Pillar number 4, appropriate evaluation. And children to receive special education and related services must be given a thorough evaluation. And the evaluation, if it is not appropriately conducted or does not monitor the information that is needed to determine placement, it is not considered appropriate. So bear that in mind. Pillar number 5, parent and teacher participation. Again, this gives parents the teeth that they need. And pillar number 6, the procedural safeguards. With every IEP meeting that you attend, honestly, you should be handed your procedural safeguards. Highly recommend that you always read the procedural safeguards and you know them, you have them memorized, you understand them fully. And then, of course, child fine is a hallmark within the IDEA itself. The state must have, in effect, policies and procedures to ensure that all children with disabilities residing in the state, including children with disabilities who are homeless or wards of the state, and children attending private schools, regardless of the severity of their disability, who are in need of special education and related services, that they are identified, located, and evaluated. A practical method is developed and implemented to determine which children are currently receiving needed special education and related services. In other words, one of the hallmarks within our community that we all frequently stand on is when an evaluation is delayed, that child fine is in fact ignored. So sometimes you might hear that a child can't be evaluated for dyslexia until they're in 3rd grade, and that's ignoring child fine. Because again, children with dyslexia can be identified as young as 5.5. A little bit more. Peter Wright of wrightslaw.com was a guest on Dyslexia Coffee Talk. He prepared an overview presentation that he shared with us, where he discussed IDEA, ADA, the American with Disabilities Act, and Section 504. I've included here within the presentation a link to our coffee talk session with Peter Wright, as well as his presentation. Also quickly, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is a civil rights law. It incorporates by reference the American with Disabilities Act, and its purpose is to protect individuals from discrimination and to provide access to services. On the International Dyslexia Association's homepage, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you will find a map of the United States. And if you click on your state, you'll actually be taken to a list of all of the laws that have been both proposed and passed. Bear in mind that just because it's listed doesn't mean that it passed. So that's an important distinction to make, but it is a handy reference for your individual state that you can check out to find out what the laws within your state are. So we're coming close to the end of this presentation. And within this, I have a list of recommended reading. We have a pretty robust recommended reading list on our website, but I don't want to leave you without listing some of what we believe to be the core books. For general knowledge, I highly recommend the following. The first is If Only I Would Have Known by Faith Borkowski. I also recommend her book, Failing Students or Failing Schools. Honestly, I think this should be required reading by absolutely everybody, teachers and parents of normative children. Absolutely everybody should read this book because it explains how education shifted to whole language and then to balanced literacy, and why it's a great explanation of why our children are never going to read under those pedagogies. Raising a Child with Dyslexia, What Every Parent Needs to Know by Don Wynn. The Teacher Who Couldn't Read by John Corcoran. Overcoming Dyslexia by Dr. Sally Shaywitz. Honestly, that's the Bible within our community. The Knowledge Gap by Natalie Wexler is honestly one of my all-time favorite books. It will absolutely scare you to death, but it's a fantastic book and it explains so much, even beyond reading and reading instruction within our country. Why Johnny Can't Read by Rudolph Flesch. Conquering Dyslexia by Dr. Jan Hasbrook. And Helping Students Take Control of Everyday Functions by Paula Moraine, which we mentioned earlier within the presentation. If you want to break it down into specific areas, The Science of How the Brain Learns How to Read. We recommend How We Learn by Stanislaus Dehaene. Stanislaus Dehaene. Now I'm like merging my words together as I speak. I'm sorry, I've been talking for a long time. Language at the Speed of Sight by Dr. Mark Seidenberg. Proust and the Squid by Dr. Marianne Wolf. For Special Education Law and Advocacy, of course, Special Education Law by Peter Wright. From Emotions to Advocacy and All About IEPs, both again by Peter Wright. For Dyscalculia tools, I recommend Multiplication and Division Facts for the Whole to Part Learner by Christopher Wooden. He also has a website, woodenmath.com, which is an amazing resource I highly recommend. For Written Expression, Speech to Print by Dr. Louisa Moats, The Writing Revolution by Judith C. Hochman and Natalie Wexler, and From Talking to Writing, Strategies for Supporting Narrative and Expository Writing by Terrell M. Jennings and Charles W. Haynes. For your children, Fish in a Tree is a very sweet story. It's a great book. I do highly recommend it. It's called Dyslexia by Jennifer Moore Malinaw. Looking for Heroes, One Boy, 1 Year, 100 Letters by Aidan Colvin. Dyslexia Explained by Mike Jones. I'm stuttering because I've been talking for so long. Please forgive me. You can find his book on Nessie.com. What I Need by Tiffany James, also on Nessie.com. Thank You, Mr. Falker by Patricia Palazzo. And the Hank Zipper series by our beloved Henry Winkler and his partner, Lynn Oliver. Various resources and helpful links, of course, the International Dyslexia Association. Don't forget to look in your local area for your state chapters of the IDA. You may, depending on the size of your state, you may have multiple chapters of the IDA. So it can be a great resource for local information. The Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity, which is by the doctors Sally and Bennett Shaywitz. Rightslaw.com. National Center for Learning Disabilities, understood.org, the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, Parents Resource Network, IEP Help, A Day in Our Shoes, Learning Ally, and of course, I have to include our own website, thedyslexiainitiative.org. Helpful links, I've included various articles, flyers, etc. But you've got the Dyslexia Basics, the Dyslexia Stress Anxiety Connection, IDA fact sheets. We have a printable flyer for self-dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. We have a rather robust list of accommodations, including printable flyers by subject areas. IDA's What is Structured Literacy infographic, Structured Literacy, Effective Instruction for Students with Dyslexia and Related Reading Difficulties, and Nancy Young's Ladder of Reading. There's also Scarborough's Reading Rope, Joan Sedita's Writing Rope. We have the parent sessions, and I've included some of our favorite coffee talk links. Dr. Louisa Moats, Dr. David Kilpatrick, William Van Cleve, Chris Wooden, a video called Dysgraphia is More Than Messy Handwriting by Dr. Brenda Taylor. You can also look up various free International Dyslexia Association conference recordings, and of course, the U.S. Department of Education Protecting Students with Disabilities. For teachers, some links that I've included: Dyslexia in the Classroom, What Every Teacher Needs to Know, Structured Literacy, an Introductory Guide, Knowledge and Practice Standards for Teachers of Reading, University Programs accredited by the International Dyslexia Association, Independent Teacher Training Programs accredited by IDA. Again, Dysgraphia is More Than Messy Handwriting by Dr. Brenda Taylor, and free IDA conference recordings. And some of our favorite blog posts. It's great to be different things by Titan. I'm gonna always butcher Titan's last name. I don't mean to butcher Titan's last name, but I'm always gonna do it. I hope his mom Tiffany forgives me, but Gabrielisi, I'll never say it right for some reason. I just can't get my mouth around his beautiful name. Time to Burn the Boat by Faith Borkowski. 6 Decades Later, Why We Can't Wait, again by Faith Borkowski. The Cost of Refusing to Diagnose Dyslexia by Lauren Taylor. Behaviors Before Dyslexia by Lauren Taylor. The School to Prison Pipeline. What does dysgraphia mean? Things to consider when seeking remediation, and the 12 stages. I've included here in the last 2 slides references that are presented throughout the presentation. I hope that you found this information helpful. I hope that you will find sessions 2 and 3 equally as helpful. Thank you for participating with this session today. And I hope that you have a great evening, afternoon, morning, what have you. But take care. Bye.